is not going to make it any louder for you, but we'll leave Judy wired up so that you can hear her.
Wired.
And this will allow us to be clear on the video that we're doing. So we're going to be talking about the fourth discipline here, and that is reinforcing clarity. And really, what we do about this, it goes back to, we've talked about how do we over communicate that clarity, crafting the message, making sure that you do it in various ways to support the different learning styles, but also to support just the different interpersonal styles that people have. We have one organization we're working with, and what we've done is we went through and we talked about the behaviors. So what are the behaviors that support the brand image of that organization? And to reinforce this is where we go here, is we had each department, this was great because they actually had exactly the right number of departments for the number of behaviors that they had. So each department took a different behavior, and they were tasked with coming up with a picture that communicated or reinforced that particular behavior. So they could all dress up and act it out. They could find something that represented that. But we turned it into a fun activity for the organization. So that engaged them, made them feel like part of it. We talk about how the recruiting, hiring, onboarding, performance management, compensation, recognition, firing. So Judy and David, y'all share with us some of the things that you've seen work well and what hasn't worked well, especially if we look at an existing environment. When we're talking about reinforcing the clarity that we've worked so hard to create and continuing to support a cohesive leadership team, one of the areas where I've found this breaks down is in compensation and what we tie to compensation. I guess we'll start ladies first, and then we'll go over to David.
Okay. Well, this would be a personal experience in my part. I once had a position, and it was a directorship position of an organization that did not have what we've been talking about. In fact, I never got a job description. So I wasn't even clear on what I was supposed to be doing outside of recruiting certain specialty blood donors. And I did what I thought was my best, what I thought that they wanted, and we came up to performance review that following year. There was nothing to evaluate with except their interpretation of what I had done, and unfortunately they figured that somebody else could do it better because I had no guidance. So if you don't have that clarity of what you expect your employee to do, don't expect them to do what you think you want them to do. And it's just, that's a lifetime example for me of what doesn't work when there isn't clarity.
I'm actually working with a client right now that this particular client has had tremendous issues with turnover and can't seem to keep the people. When I talk to the CEO, why do you think you're having problems? A consistent theme started to emerge. He consistently said, well, the people we're hiring aren't very smart. And that wasn't his exact words, but every time I brought up, what about this individual? Well, he's just not very smart. Okay? What about this individual? I don't think she was very smart. And what's clear as I've worked with the company is there isn't clear guidelines about what's expected. And so the individuals that are coming into the organization are at a tremendous disadvantage because it is not clear what's expected. It's not clear what the values are. This particular CEO, he started the company, and he is a very, very smart guy. You don't have to spend very long with him to realize he's a very, very smart guy. But he started the company. He has made it go. It's a lot of it the force of his work and his will. And so it's just not a lot of clarity around him about what the values are, what he's expecting to continue from there on out. And so it's just created a lot of confusion for a lot of folks in who ought to be hired, what I ought to do, how much I ought to get paid. So that's just a very fresh example with me.
Mhm.
How would you say compensation plans can either reinforce or undermine the clarity that we're trying to create here around values and behaviors and why?
I'll jump in on this one.
Go ahead.
One of the issues you get into is if we're not reinforcing the values that we want with the compensation. So, for instance, sales is an easy one to pick on. What are we reinforcing for sales? We want unit sales out of them. So we're going to give them an incentive based on unit sales. So what does that say to them? That says, I need to get all the sales I can. Okay? If it's not clear what the values of the organization are, then that gets translated by some people as I get all the sales I can with whatever methods I can use. And that's an easy one to pick on. But that filters then through the rest of the organization as well. And it communicates who's most important and what's most important. So we can say some certain attitudes and things are most important, but if the people that get promoted are exhibiting different values, then that's what's really important to the organization. And that's where the money talks.
Judy?
That's right, I'm already wired. On the flip side of that, compensation is a part of the package. Of course, there's various parts of compensation, various things that may go into it, including the money. And certainly, the financial compensation needs to be tied to the values of the company and the performance of the employee within those values. But do remember, money is a very short-term motivator. Once you get that raise, you're excited for a while, you earned it, you work hard for it. A couple months later, that's what you're living on and you're used to it. And sometimes that motivation doesn't stick around unless you've got what we've been talking about, clear messaging, an open workplace, freedom of speech without threat, all of those other things to support the employee beyond the compensation.
Yeah, that's a great point, Judy, because as you think about the millennials that are coming into the workplace, and you think about the research, remember the slide that I put up there, 81% want to work for an organization where they feel valued and they feel they're contributing and there's a bigger purpose. So for many of them, sure, there's a financial aspect. Some of you are more ambitious. They want the BMW 3 Series or whatever so they can impress their friends. But they also want to be able to not have to fade off into the shadows when people start asking them, what does your organization stand for? What are you doing? How are you making a difference in the world? And these are the people that are going to be producing and doing the things that run our organizations. They're already coming in now. And over the next 10 to 15 years, it's just going to be more and more and more. And so we've got to be sure that we have clarity around this. We've got another client right now, and it was really interesting. One of the exercises that we do when we're trying to create a cohesive management team, and we'll do these exercises oftentimes around change management, because that's what this really is. Let me say something here also. You don't have to have what you would consider a bad organization for this to have value to you. There are a lot of good organizations that are just ready to take it to the next level. And I will tell you something, you're going to have to take it to the next level to attract top talent. If you stay mediocre, if you stay just okay, then you're going to hire people that are okay with okay, and then they're going to hire people that are okay with okay, and you're just going to be on this little downhill spiral. If you want to keep attracting top performers, A players like to be around A players. And so getting your organization at the top of the game, because again, it's getting more competitive, not less out there. So we will do an exercise with these teams where we go around and each person takes a turn in the hot seat and everybody shares what they believe the one overarching strength that this particular individual brings to that team. And then we go around and we talk about what's the one area that this person could improve that would have the biggest impact on moving the team forward, or the one thing that they do that holds us back. Do you think that requires some vulnerability? Absolutely. Do you think it requires some trust? Oh, you better believe it. And so we like to have whoever the leader is in that exercise do that. But as you talk about that, you're reinforcing all of this stuff, you model that, and then when we talk about that cascading communication, the charge is that they take this out and they do this with their teams. Talk about behaviors with your team. Now here's something that's a little bit more of it's an unpleasant topic, but it's the reality of the world in which we live. And this is, terminations or firing. So you've gone through this and you've got somebody that they're just not getting it. And it's not a style thing, it's just a misalignment with what the organization's about and the values. How do you handle that? What happens if you don't?
Here's the good news. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that if you're very clear on what your organizational values are, most of those people, the vast majority of those people, I don't have a percentage, but high majority will self-select.
Mm-hmm.
They will say, I don't want to work here. And you will say, good. Those people who just don't get it, if you've been very clear about values, it becomes much simpler, not easy, it becomes simpler to have those conversations with them, that what you're looking for in this team and what this team stands for are different. And you can also say that's not good or bad. That doesn't mean you're bad, that doesn't mean we're bad. We just don't line up. That's a huge advantage if you've been dealing with behaviors and values and alignment. It's easy then to have that conversation, easier to have that conversation when someone doesn't line up with those things.
From my experience, many years of management of large departments, document. Know that you've got the job description, that you've got the outline of what this person is responsible for, that it is clear what the company values are, what the expectations are. And if you don't document, when you get to that point, you have not got a leg to stand on, especially in larger organizations. So have that internal employee file that you keep at your desk or wherever that is, or have your team leaders keep it. And I'm not talking about all the bad stuff. Document everything that you observe about the employee, because you also want to have the documentation for performance evaluation and raises. So if you're making a weekly or bi-weekly checklist on your people, what you've seen in the last couple of weeks, you have no problem when you get to the performance evaluation, be it the termination or promotion, you've got the evidence. So make sure you've got a file on each of your people documenting their behaviors and inconsistencies or consistencies with the values of your company and the expectations.
What happens if you don't pull the trigger?
If you don't pull the trigger and let go of the person who is not consistent with the values expectations, needs of the company. Every other employee knows it. So you're undermining the entire staff by not taking appropriate action with the one who is not in alignment and needs to find a place where he or she is aligned. Because you're just, yeah, it's like the elephant in the room. Everybody knows it's there, but nobody will say anything. Yeah, we need to get the elephant out.
Slow to hire, quick to fire. Make sure the people you're bringing in line up with the values, that they are the kind of people you want. And if that doesn't happen, you're doing them a favor, you're doing yourself a favor by letting them go. The client I mentioned earlier has an individual that her values do not line up with the vision for the company, the values for the company. And I anticipate that soon I will have to work with him and help him take the step to let her go. And that's the thing I'm trying to help him see is that if the values that you want in this company, if you've communicated those and reinforced those, now when it comes time to exercise that, if you do not help people who don't line up with those values, if you don't help them find other opportunities, you are going to erode what you stand for. Everything you're working for is going to get washed away slowly. And again, it won't be urgent. It won't pop up in your inbox. It'll happen slowly over time. And so hanging on to that one person is a huge boat anchor. It's a huge detriment to all the results that you're hoping to get.
Thank you, David and Judy. I just want to emphasize something there. You heard David say, slow to hire, quick to fire. And in quick to fire, that doesn't mean, as David said, you're not going to coach that individual. You're not going to give them a chance. Now, if you don't have any clarity around what the behavioral expectations are within the organization, and that hasn't been communicated, how in the world are you going to hold somebody accountable to that? If you try, they're going to say, well, I didn't sign up for that. That's not what I understood. So now where are you? Now you're at square one. And you've got to say, well, okay, well, that's the way it is now, and then you begin your documentation. But how many of you have seen, and we use movie analogies a lot, because first of all, what communication styles do movies have in them? They've got visual and they've got auditory. And some of them are, especially if they pull you in enough, they're actually kinesthetic. So I mean, you're engaged in that movie, and they create emotional anchors. Now think about it. I don't care which one of those four styles you are. Think about the most powerful memories you have, and there's probably an emotion associated with that, and that is why that memory is so vivid and real to you. So that should say something to you as a leader that's trying to communicate. Anytime you can tie the message with emotion, it is going to be remembered and valued longer. The movie I want to mention to you, how many of you have seen The Internship? A couple of you. If you have not seen that movie, that's your homework assignment for the weekend. Now, if you're not, it's actually fairly entertaining. You may not want to have young children in the room. Teenagers and above, you're okay. But the point of that movie is it really, while it's a comedy, it takes you through Google's vetting and onboarding process. Look at it from that perspective. Chick-fil-A, we've used them many times, and one of the reasons I like to use them is because they do this so well. You could go to Publix, they're another one. Wegmans up in the New England, Canada area is another one. In fact, Publix is actually modeled after Wegmans.
That's right.
So these organizations that do this well, how easy is it to get hired by organizations that were up, those logos that we showed. It's tough, isn't it? It's tough. Do they have a waiting list? Do all of them have a waiting list for candidates? Yeah, they do. Do y'all have a waiting list at IHG?
For certain roles. Yes, we do.
Absolutely, yeah, for certain roles.
Yep.
If you build a great organization, people will line up outside your door because it is a privilege to be a part of that organization. So when you think about your hiring process, is that the message that you're communicating?
Chick-fil-A opens about 83 stores a year right now at their current pace. Every year, they have over 8,000 applicants for owner-operators. It's crazy.
David, how does somebody, even if they're just a teenage kid that wants to work for a franchisee, what does that process look like?
It is, from what I understand, it is pretty involved. Just to go to, have any of you, do you know somebody who works for Chick-fil-A?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you've talked to them, you probably know it's a pretty involved process. You're going in and you're getting a I think that at the counter you're making $5.50 or $6 an hour, and it's a pretty involved process. I have some friends who didn't make the cut. Very high quality teenage kids that didn't get hired for one reason or another. And so it's an involved process. It feels like, to them, it felt like more what I was accustomed to coming out of college.
Yeah, there's actually 3 essay questions that you have to answer as a part of the application process. You just want to be a cashier. I don't need to answer. I want to be a fry cook. There's essay questions. Why are there essay questions? Well, are the values and behavioral expectations of that organization very clear? Yes, they are. What do you think they're looking for? They're looking for, and this is where the essay questions go, they're asking for specific examples of how these teenage kids have already demonstrated these behaviors in their life. And they're also asking them, describe to me a time where your values cost you something that you really wanted. But because you stood by your values, that was the higher ground. So what does your onboarding process look like? I had a great friend of mine growing up, and I still remember, this is how powerful it was. I mean, this was a friend of mine back in elementary school. I used to be called middle school now. But I remember the phrase, and it was, don't start, won't be none. Don't start any trouble, won't be any trouble. If you cannot hire that person from the beginning, then you don't have to worry about getting rid of them later. And that's what we're talking about, being as intentional about that hiring process. It needs to be a privilege to be a part of your organization.
I also want to say too that, I mean, obviously the goal is not to fire anybody. And so you want to try to find those people from the beginning that are going to be good fits with your organization. Someone asked a question earlier when Judy was talking about having diversity on your team. If all you do is hire people like you, you're not going to have the diversity on your team to be able to see how you're impacting your customers. Chris and I are both D's, okay? And we have a lot of different discussions when it's just him and me and the whole team. If we've got all of us there, we kind of moderate ourselves, but when
Some of our discussions get a little loud.
They get loud and they get pretty blunt. And we're okay with that. You know, we're good with that. But imagine if you hire all D's, okay? How are you going to interact with your customers? Whatever you're doing internally, that's how you're going to treat your customers. So if you're butting heads inside the building, you're going to butt heads with your customers. Same thing is true with all those things, with all the other personality styles. So my point being is that hiring process, we're focusing on the firing, but the hiring process really allows you to pick out those people who are going to excel in your organization.
Yeah, and you want people that intimidate you.
Absolutely.
I mean, you need to always be hiring up, hiring up.
That's right.
One other point I want to make on the performance management piece before we move off of this slide. We've got a client now, and one of the challenges that this organization has, especially amongst the senior leadership team, is not acting like the people in that boat that we showed you. Now, when people interview there, they think that this is a great organization. And if you go there, you would think the same. For the most part, people are friendly, they're very warm, they're receptive, very hospitable group to be with. But they have a challenge collaborating across business units and thinking like a senior leadership team rather than just a bunch of individual. You know the difference between a basketball team or a football team and a gymnastics team? Or ski jumpers. You think about the U.S. ski team versus the U.S. hockey team. With the ski team, you have a bunch of high-performing individuals that happen to be wearing the same jersey. With a hockey team, not only do they have to wear the same jersey and be high-performing, but they've got to be able to work with one another, don't they? Because there's no one person that can pull it off. And that's the challenge they're having. Guess how their performance is measured? Departmentally. There are no global goals that anybody is responsible for or accountable for. And the way you are compensated and measured is what you're going to focus on. And that's a big part of alignment when we think about this. And this is all, that's why this discipline is called reinforcing clarity. Because every part of the organization needs to reinforce the answers to those 6 questions. Everything. Anything else y'all want to add to that, Judy or David, before we move along?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So let's talk about, Lencioni talks about the 4 meetings. And how many of you love meetings? Anybody? A couple of you. Now, some people like meetings because that means I can get out of work. Or I can just unplug. It's a great excuse to not have to answer the phone or return emails and those kinds of things.
Now, in fairness, some people enjoy meetings because they feel like things are getting done in meetings. So in fairness.
Okay.
Thank you, David.
And,
There you go.
and there are some eyes that they really don't care. There's a group of people and I'm with them.
That's
We're
right.
going to have some fun. So
Just let me sit at the head of the table.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. So the reason most people don't like meetings is because what? They're a colossal waste of time, aren't they? Most meetings are. So let's talk about that real quick. And David and Judy, let's talk about this daily check-in and kind of the weekly staff, or maybe should we talk about the 2 types of meetings first?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about that. You want to talk about the 2 types of meetings?
I'm talking about it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So strategic and tactical. You've got strategic meetings that are more big picture. What direction are we going? Those types of meetings where you're making decisions. And then you've got more tactical meetings where you're actually measuring progress, you're managing a project, you're seeing how we're coming on our goals, those types of things, okay? It is highly recommended that you do not try to combine those 2 activities in the same meeting. And we do it all the time. And what happens is we get wound around the axle on some decision point, and none of the other stuff that we were trying to get done in the meeting happens.
It is that one single thing, in my opinion, that's given meetings a bad name. That one single activity of combining tactical and strategic has given all meetings a bad name.
So talk real quick about this daily check-in and the weekly staff. What is that about?
So, the daily check-in, when I talk to folks about that, I recommend that be a stand-up meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And all that is what are you working on today? And I mean, it needs, if it goes beyond that, whoever is facilitating that meeting has got to cut it off and say, I'll talk to you about that afterwards. That's a stand-up meeting. Hey, I'm working on the brown account. I'm working on the blue account. Okay. I'm going to assist him with the blue account. Okay. All right. That's all that is. If you've got 4 people, your stand-up meeting, if it lasts more than 2 minutes, it's something, you're not having a stand-up meeting. Okay, that's not a daily check-in. That doesn't mean it's not important. The daily check-in's important because now I've got a sense of what everybody's doing, and I'm not going to duplicate effort. I know what I need to be working on because we've had this discussion. It also helps clarify. Whoa, hang on. I thought I was working on the brown account. Yesterday, you told me to follow up on that phone call. Okay, all right, let's clarify that. All right, real quick, those things get taken care of without a lot of hoopla, okay? The next one, the weekly staff meeting, and that needs to be tactical. What things are coming up, what things got to get taken care of, what things need to be done. Now, that still needs to be an agenda-driven meeting. The thematic goal plays into that because we didn't have time to explain a lot about the thematic goal. But once you decide on a thematic goal, you're supporting objectives, you're defining objectives, and your standard operating objectives, then those things are what drive that weekly meeting. And those are the things we talk about. So those are the first 2 meetings.
Judy, you have anything to add there?
The only thing I would add is to confine the time. 45 to 90 minutes may still be too long for some of these weekly meetings. My understanding and my studies of meeting management say any meeting that goes over 20 minutes, you're losing your audience. Now, that may or may not always hold true, but that's a guideline that people start drifting off into their own thoughts after about 20 minutes unless it's a very engaging meeting. So just keep that in mind. Meeting management rules of, are we talking about what we need to, are we off on a tangent that we need to come back, all of those things through.
And I was gonna say, Judy, also time box those items. Because if you
Yes.
time box those items, then what happens is no one can run off into, to me, I always call it the wilderness. Because you can talk and talk and talk and say, nope, we got
Right.
20 minutes for this, 15
Right,
for
that's
that.
part of the agenda, right, David?
Yep.
Exactly. The other point I want to add with that is, rule of thumb, if it winds up that y'all as a group are talking about something that can be handled by 2 or 3 people in the room, you should not be talking in that
That's right.
in that meeting. That ought to be a topic that's immediately tabled for another discussion.
Yeah, one of the reasons that most people don't like meetings is they're not very productive, okay, if they're not run correctly. And as people look at this, where we get resistance comes back to trust, and we've got to work through this. And we've actually got, if you go to our company LinkedIn page, you'll see a company that we worked with here locally that talks about they don't know how when we first started working with them, I challenged them to do this. And they said, you've got to be kidding me. How in the world, we don't have time. And I said, just trust me on this one, try it. And you'll see the testimonial, they're now saying, I have no idea how we ran this organization without it. The daily meeting, the reason people don't like the daily meeting or push back on it is because they don't want to be what?
Accountable.
Accountable. I want to just show up and kind of fade into the paneling, and then 5 o'clock rolls around and I leave. Those aren't the people you want in your organization. Let your competitors hire them.
And you don't want to let the daily meeting turn into the weekly meeting.
That's a great
Right.
point too, David. You don't. So that stand-up meeting is exactly that. A stand-up meeting, if somebody says, hey, I'm working on this, but I've got some, I'm having a problem with such and such, excellent. That's as far as it needs to go. And anybody that thinks they can contribute to the solution, get with that person afterwards. You're not solving it in that stand-up meeting. And then the weekly meeting, if you're using the thematic goal model, that becomes your agenda for the weekly meeting. And that's why it's tactical. You're not deciding on what the goals should be. You're evaluating whether or not you're making progress to the goals and which one is the critical goal for that week. Which one's the furthest off the rails, and that's what everybody, as a team, comes together with the resources over which they've been given responsibility to figure out how do we solve that problem. Are you short on people? Hey, you know what? We're a little bit slow. I think I can throw you, I've got a couple of bodies I can donate over here to help you get through that. Now, do we do this stuff perfectly in our own organization? No. But it's uncommon discipline and persistence. You just it's constant effort. It's constant effort over and over. All right, talk about the ad hoc, the strategic meetings. So you're going to do those maybe 3-4 times a year. And what goes on in those?
So part of what you would do in those strategic meetings, whereas the weekly meetings have been, are we on task for completing our goal? Their strategic meetings start asking the question, what should the goal be? And is the goal having an impact? So one of the questions that I would always expect to get asked, and we recommend at least 2 to 3 times a year, certainly annually, but we recommend 2 to 3 times a year. You need to be asking the question, is this the best goal? And is the goal that we set, the thematic goal that we set, is that having the impact that we anticipated it would have? If not, we need to change the goal. So that becomes kind of the strategic, in a nutshell, that's the strategic discussion.
And there's a lot of future planning that can go on there as well. Okay, here's where we are today. Here's where we want to be. What are the steps? What are the goals we need to put in place to get there? So this is where your forward thinkers need to come into play. Some people can think out 3 to 5 years. I can't. I got to think out for next week, for God's sakes. But not really. I'm playing with you guys. But you gotta have those strategic thinkers on your team that can think out that far, and then the support people can help to build the pathway. But on those strategic meetings is where you're gonna do that, not in your quick weekly meetings. Those are, where are we now, what do we need to do if we're not where we need to be? All that kind of very in the moment stuff. These strategic meetings are gonna be thinking out further.
Now, one last thing is, as we're wrapping up on your meetings, and this is very, very important, especially around strategic meetings, because you've got the annual or semi-annual strategic meeting where you really you're setting that next set of goals, you're really analyzing what's going on in the marketplace to impact so that you're making those decisions in context. And then your other meetings are really around, are we still doing the right things? Are we still focused on the right things? Are we still hiring the right people? Who do we need to develop? Where do we have gaps? Do we have the right people, to use Jim Collins' term? Do we have the right people in the right seats on the bus? And these are the things that are happening in there. There's a lot of noise that can fog clarity if you don't manage those meetings correctly. And here's what I mean by that. Even in your tactical meetings, certainly the weekly meeting, not the stand-up meeting, but your weekly meeting, as you close your meeting, you always want to be sure that you've got commitment around what was agreed upon in that meeting. All right, what did we agree to do? What have we agreed to in this meeting? Most of the time, we pack our meeting schedule too tight, or we try to pack too much into a meeting, and we don't leave time to get that clarity coming out of the meeting. Because more often than not, as you sit there and you've got somebody that's been charged with being the secretary for that meeting, and they go back through, well, this is what we've decided on, and somebody will go, I thought we were just talking about that. I didn't know we had made a decision. Is it better to have that come out before you all adjourn than after? Absolutely. And depending on how much time you have, you can decide to either postpone that and say, all right, well, it's obvious we need to come back together on that one. You've got some reservations. We want to know what they are. We need to talk about that. Or if you've got the time in that meeting, or you don't have the luxury to come back together again, you need to make a decision now, then that gets that out. So you can have that conversation. It may not change the result of the decision, but as David mentioned, hey, people just need to be heard and have their viewpoint sincerely appreciated by the group. They don't have to always get their way to be okay and to give commitment.
One last thing on the strategic meetings, and this is brazen marketing. It's always good to have someone outside the organization come in and help with those strategic meetings. We would be happy to do that.
Thank you, David. Yes. And now back to our regularly scheduled. The other thing that you want to do out of that meeting is, once you've decided on what you've agreed to, any of the action items, again, go back to who must do what. Who owns each of the action items? When are those deliverables due? And make sure everybody's on the same page there. And then this last part is super, super, super critical. What, if anything, needs to be communicated out of this meeting, to whom, and by when, and how. And you need to take the time as a group in that meeting, and you need to go ahead and outline the talking points so that the message that gets communicated is identical. What you don't want to have is somebody gets one message, somebody else gets another message, because then you're undermining what?
Alignment.
Trust and alignment. Why didn't they tell me that? Well, that's not what I heard. And I'll tell you what, if the message is critical enough, write a script.
Mm-hmm.
And have the managers just read off that script. And then when they deliver that message, make sure that they leave time for Q&A. And that they've got enough information to create clarity. And then everything else keeps reinforcing that message. So you want to know, what did we agree to? What have we decided? What are the action items, and who must do what? And what, if anything, needs to be communicated out of this meeting, to whom, by when, and how? And if you'll do that off the backside of your meetings, and you use some of these other techniques, what you'll find is your meetings actually reinforce the cohesive team. They reinforce the clarity you're trying to create within the organization. Your communication's a lot better, and you start moving more towards results. And you're trying to create a culture of accountability, because that's what everybody says they want. We need more accountability around here. And often it's because there's a lack of trust, and there's a lack of trust because there's a lack of clarity, and I mean, it's this cycle, isn't it? So, anything else? We're just about to the top of the hour. Anything else that you'd like to add?
I have frequently gone to conferences, heard discussions like this, walked away from discussions, and I always think, if these bozos just knew how much I had to get done, they wouldn't be talking like that. They don't have real jobs. And so I would encourage you to leave today and decide what you're going to do with this information. And then, as I think Chris mentioned it earlier, put time on your calendar. Put time on your calendar sometime next week and decide, what am I going to do with this information? And take 15, 30 minutes, walk back through it. Am I going to do anything with this information? If so, what? And then start prioritizing how you want to attack it and things you want to start working on. And calendar those. The thing I want to encourage you not to do is to take your notes, put them in your briefcase, put them in your car, and forget about it. Set some time in your calendar, decide what you're going to do. And if it's nothing, at least you've decided, I'm going to do nothing with this stuff.
That's a great point, David. I mean, this stuff works. And the reason you hear the passion in our voices is because this is what we've used. We've literally transformed organizations. We've seen other folks apply this and transform organizations with it. I told you the story about the technology company here in Sewanee. This is what I did. I didn't call it this because Lencioni hadn't written the books at that time, but this is what we did. Every turnaround that I did, this is what we did. It works. It absolutely works. I've got another startup that I'm involved in right now. Cirrus owns a piece of. It's a technology company in the software space. We are all three up here busy people. And if we didn't use this, we could not be effective at all. So I want to encourage you not to dismiss it, as that's real easy for them to say as consultants because they don't live in the real world. We have to use this stuff every day. And again, we don't execute on it perfectly, but it's that accountability piece. And because we've got that trust, we continue to hold one another accountable for it. And it comes back to that direction, not perfection, right? And so you want to continue to be failing forward. Judy, you have anything to add as we close up?
I just want to thank everybody for coming today and being a part of what we're doing here. Hope to see more of you in the future, but I'm with them. Please use what you've learned here today. It really does help. I was 30 years in management and didn't have these tools or skill sets in the companies I was with, and I remember the frustrations of meetings that went bloody meetings. They would go on forever, and then you have to go find a way to get your work done. This